Hello everyone, today is watercolor day, so I'm going to teach you how to use these paints. There's a couple of different sets that all look roughly the same, but the important thing is that they're in pans, which means that they're dry and they're in a container similar to this one. So you might, if you open yours, have slightly different colors in a slightly different order. That doesn't really matter, but what matters is that they're watercolors, and that's what we're going to be using for today. We're also going to grab a couple of other supplies. So watercolors requires us to use water. So please grab a cup of water, fill it about like half to 3/4 full. You don't want it too high, so then it'll splash all over the place. So grab my water cup. Sometimes I grab 2 water cups. It's just depending on how I'm feeling. You will also need your paint brushes. So I gave a pack today. If you have the exact same pack as me, you can open that up. And I'm going to grab one of the smaller ones. So at the back you can see that it says rounds. So I like to use rounds for kind of detailed stuff. There's a 4, it's a little smaller, and a 6 that's a good medium. So I'm going to be using the 6, but it doesn't super matter. So my paintbrush, water cup. It's really important today that you have a paper towel. So that's going to help, since we're working with water, to dry off our brush, to do some cleanup work. And then the last thing that you really need is a sheet of watercolor paper. So you should have received something that looks like this, and it's a whole stack of them. Watercolor paper is a little bit thicker, has a little bit of a texture to it depending on the type. But I like to open this from the back. It rips a little bit easier from the back. And grab a sheet just like that. So I'll close that out. So today I'm going to be working vertically. That's just going to be a little bit easier for me. I tend to put my watercolors and my water on the side that I draw with, or my dominant hand, so it's on the right side. So there's not a lot of crossing over my paper to get to the water, and that's just an easier setup for me. I'm also going to be using my paper towel, and I just put that kind of down close. It's possible that today you'll want a pencil and an eraser, so I just have those handy for me always when I'm doing art. And we're going to write our names on this, as well as the date. And we're going to be making a color wheel. So the most important aspect, I would say, of color theory is the color wheel. Before we do that, I'm going to teach you, and we're going to experiment with how these watercolors work. So let us get started now that we have all of our supplies. First thing that we want to do is activate the paint. So right now, if I run my hand through these that have never been used before, you can open your set and you'll see that it might look slightly different. So you have different colors in a different order. There are some different sets. These ones are kind of older, so you might have the Grumbacher ones that look like this. You can see they're kind of used up now. And this is the order of those colors roughly. I have another set that looks a little bit different, like the Angoras look a little different. You might have a transparent set, so double check if it says transparent. The biggest difference between your transparent set, if you have one of these, is that it's missing this kind of pink color, but that's it, and you don't super need it. So if you don't see that your colors are exactly the same as mine, then it's totally fine. Doesn't really matter for today. Okay, so we are going to start by activating these dry paints out. And to do that, we're going to use our paintbrush and our water. And you're not going to scrub, but you're just kind of going to drop in some water in any color that you think you're going to use. I'll have all of mine kind of ready for me right now, but I'm really going to start out by using the black. So that should be one of the bottom ones on yours. There's several brown options, some yellow. This one has 3 blues. Some of them only have 2, and that's fine. So just kind of get your paints ready by adding water to them, and that'll loosen the pigment up so you can pick it up. So we'll start with that. I'm going to start at the bottom of my page today. If you want to, you can flip your paper around and you can use this a little bit later, so it doesn't really matter how you set it up as long as you have all the components. But what we want to do is we want to start mixing our colors, and I'm going to teach you how to go from light to dark. So when it comes to our paper is white. So if we have the white of our paper showing, then that will act as like the lighter parts of our drawing or our painting. So if I wanted something to be white, even if you have a white watercolor, you don't really use it. You mostly use the paper and just leave it alone. Now the issue with watercolors versus when we're using pencils is that we can't really technically erase. I can lighten things with a technique, but I can't really get rid of things if I make them dark. So just as a fun experiment, we can see that if I paint down just pure water at the bottom here, I'm just painting water in like a rectangular formation, like you can't really see it. It's white, it's left alone. That only works because my water is very clear and pretty. If my water has any color in it, then that color from there will almost kind of like paint that. So you want to be careful. So I want to experiment with going from light to dark or dark to light, but I think going light to dark is a little bit easier and more natural. So like I said, we're going to be using the black paint today. So a mistake that I see is people will grab directly from here and then paint down. We don't want to do that because this is super concentrated. So we use the top kind of plastic bit to mix our watercolors. So I'm going to take some of that black paint with my brush and I'm going to put it down at the top there. So just a little bit at the top. Now my paintbrush is kind of full of that paint from down there, so I want to wipe it off real quick. And I want a very, very light gray right now. So in order to make it lighter, I need to add more water. Our water is kind of like our white or our lightener. So I want less pigment and lots of gray. So I'm going to dip in there, not swish it around, but dip it in my water and just keep adding that to there. So I kind of have like a really, really light puddle. And then now that I have this very light gray puddle, I'm going to paint either like a square or a circle on my piece of paper, like that. So super light. You can see it's kind of shiny because of the amount of water that's on it. I'm going to slowly now make it a little bit darker. So I don't want a ton of water on there, so I'll pick up a little bit with my brush. Take some of my paper towel, kind of dry that out, pick it up a little bit. And I'm slowly going to add a little bit more black. So I'm going to take like a dot of my black, add it to my water, and see if that gets any darker. If it doesn't get any darker, you can take your kind of paintbrush, just grab a little bit more paint and just kind of poke at it and dot that down. And you should see that it's getting a little bit darker as I go along. So I'm going to keep doing that until I get to black. I'm going to make this a little bit more dramatic of a difference. Now, if you get too dark too quickly, so let me make an example of what would be too dark too quickly. So if I suddenly get way too dark like that, what you're going to do is take your water and your brush, and just kind of swish it in there, and dry that out and kind of pick it up with your brush. And then add more water in there. So if you make a mistake and it's too dark, you're going to suck up some of the paint while it's still wet, and that's a lot harder to do if you let it dry. So suck it up with your paintbrush. You can also suck it up with your paper towel, technically, so you can just kind of pat it dry, and that should also work for you. So I'm making a slightly darker, but not too much darker gray here. Let's keep going. Try to hit at least like 7 boxes before you get black. And again, if it doesn't get dark enough, then you can just add a little bit more paint. Always mix at the top first. Don't grab directly from there. Leave a little bit of space. If you put them too close, they'll start to like bleed together, and that's not what you want. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, and then I think I'm getting pretty close to like a pure black at this point. If there's any water, then it will tend to be a little bit lighter or darker when you dry. Watercolor tends to look a little bit lighter when it dries. And so I have one, technically the first one is just blank, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Then for my very last one, I'm going to go directly from here, but I do want to get my brush wet first. Then grab directly from there. This is only if you want literally the pure color, and it should still be pretty watery, and then there you go. So paint that down. Doesn't have to go all the way to the edge of the paper, that's just my allowance in case I want to go kind of far with it. And if later I notice that this gets really light, then I can just go over it with another layer. So that's what's nice about watercolor. So we started by making a value scale at the bottom. So we're gonna write down either above or below here. So this is a watercolor value scale. So we went from high value, so lots of water, to more paint, so light to dark on here. You can also try it the opposite way, where you start really dark and you add more and more and more and more water to make it more transparent. So right now your paint is probably very wet. You don't want your paper to get super soaked or anything like that, because then it starts to bend and buckle a lot. So if it's starting to do that, then you kind of want to help it along, kind of curl it a little bit at the edges. Some people like to tape their watercolor paper down so it doesn't bend so much, but that's not necessary for us. So value scale is done. You are going to try another value scale, either above this or below, depending on where you have room, but you're going to use a different color now. So pick any color that you want to, but I would say like the yellow is a little bit too light, and if you have a white, like there's no point in doing that. So pick one of the other colors that isn't that, and then you're going to go from white to there. If your water is very dark, watercolor is very sensitive, which is like depending on what color your water is, you want to clear it out. So if yours is very gray, then you want to go dump this out and get new water to start this next part. Okay, so I'm just doing the same thing that I did before. Doesn't have to line up, it doesn't really matter. Remember that if it's not getting dark enough, you can just add a little bit more paint. You can also just try dropping in a little bit more. If it gets too dark, you can take either your paper towel to kind of suck up some of the paint on there, or use a dry brush to do that. Okay. So you can see that these are all fairly wet. One of the problems that I see is people will try to grab kind of drier paint. And so if yours is turning out very hard to paint down and it's kind of got this scratchy quality to it, that means that you aren't using enough water. So that's why I say to grab from up here as opposed to directly from there, and to always make sure that your paints are activated with water. So that's a little bit of troubleshooting for you. So we don't want to do something like this. We also don't want there to be so much water that these ones are really light, but you want it to go from dark to light and control that. So those are your value scales for watercolor.